public opportunity to discuss matters of public interest within the committee's jurisdiction, including items on or not on the agenda.
We have no one.
Oh, wow, okay. Consent agenda.
I'll make a motion, we approve the consent agenda.
I second. We'll call the roll.
Directors Monk,
Aye.
Pearson.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Okay, and we have a presentation by Ron McFarland.
Thank you, Directors. Rhonda McFarland, Chief Financial Officer. For probably the last couple years especially, our agency has been discussing the need for a formal reserve policy, and so we have drafted one for your review. It is, we believe, in the best interest of the district to adopt a formal policy. It's best financial practices. It will put us in a better position for unexpected expenditures or loss of revenue. It will help us with our planning for short and long-term plans as far as our infrastructure is concerned, and it will account for all the various reserves that we have. We have put together both a minimum and maximum for the various types of reserves that we have. The minimum, we don't necessarily have that amount of money on hand, but it is something that will be a target for the future. And the maximum that we targeted was just to make sure that we never have funds in excess of what's absolutely necessary. We have a number of definitions in the beginning. If anybody has any questions on those definitions, I'd be more than happy to answer them. Or we can go through the various categories and talk about the funding levels. I will leave it to the committee members as to how they would like to approach the discussion on this.
Well, I'm curious exactly how you came up with those limits. Last time we talked about this, I know that there was a discussion on best practices. And with these different funds, do they have a best practice for each type of fund we have, or did you guys just?
No. I will tell you what we discussed previously was the Government Finance Officers Association of the United States and Canada recommends at a minimum for your unassigned fund balance, your operating reserves, to be a minimum of 2 months, and we are recommending at this point 15%, which is 1.8 months. So it's very, very close to the minimum recommended by the GFOA. They indicate on other types of funds, and even on general operating funds, it's dependent upon your circumstances. So the more, say for example, with the operating reserves, the more volatile your funding sources are, the higher reserves that they would recommend. So at this point, with that minimum is about 10%, or is 10% more than what we have historically seen as our minimum. So it is ambitious to triple it, and it gets us very, very close to what the minimum is recommended by GFOA. There are some of the reserves that we have identified that are contractually required. For example, our debt service reserves. We have 2 debt issuances that have reserve requirements, one being our pension obligations and the other one being the lease revenue bonds that were used to finance the headquarters building. In those cases, we must comply with the amount specified in the debt obligation in order to be in compliance with our covenants. And we have some reserves under our restricted as well. Our development fees, we are required to only use those on capital infrastructure. So at any given time, depending on our needs, that amount can fluctuate. I recommended at this point that we have at least $500,000 on hand at any time in case some of the planned infrastructure that we're moving forward on, if we have any cost overruns or changes of scope of work or something like that. I will also say on the fiduciary reserves, it's a rather small amount, but those are monies that, again, are restricted. We have a formal deferred compensation committee, and these are funds that come from the participants that are used for administration. So I talked to Debbie Kelly that sits on the committee. She's the one that handles their finances and came up with the range for that. On our SERPT, that's the trust fund that we opened in 2012. I will say that, you'll be hearing more about all of our post-retirement medical obligation liabilities in the regular meeting because we have our actuary attending today. And in this case, we tied that into the actuarial valuation with having the maximum being our present value of our obligation. And the minimum I left at what we presently have. And so as we're funding the ARC, we'll be moving ourselves closer to that amount. And then the only section on here that I haven't talked about is the section in the middle called the committed fund balance. And in there we have 4 different categories. And we have our self-insurance reserves. We're self-insured for workers' compensation. And we do an actuarial evaluation on that liability as well. And based on the most recent valuation from our actuary, I put those figures in. We have a new valuation that's being prepared and will probably be issued in the next 30 days. That, as we describe in the monitoring of this policy, would be an event that would require us to go back and look at this and redetermine those numbers. Our compensated absence reserves, under generally accepted accounting principles, we have to track any amounts that are due our employees based on our vacation and sick leave policies that are earned and not used. And so we, at any given point, with the termination of an employee or retirement, have an obligation to pay a certain amount based on our labor contracts. So
What percentage of that outstanding hours balance do we keep as cash?
what we've done is, we haven't really designated any cash amount in the past, but we do designate an amount in the budget, and it's usually what we anticipate spending in the next 12 months. And that's a difficult number to know if what we put in there is going to be exactly on or not on. It all depends on what our employees choose to do as far as retirements go. But we look backwards at like our most recent fiscal year that we ended and use that number to help us estimate. And so in this case, if you had that all set aside, that would be great if you could afford to do that. But currently we have $4.3 million in the budget for that amount. And then the next item on the committed fund balance is capital replacement reserve. We don't even have one of those right now, but we should have one. And so I tried to tie that into the government-wide financial statements where we determine what our annual depreciation is for our capital assets, which have been running $3.5 million a year. So I put that down as the minimum, and then the maximum being the accumulated depreciation of $47.1 million. So then I show, currently we don't have anything like that. So that's a target that we would be shooting for in the future. I will say, even with those dollar amounts, if you have a capital asset that lasts quite a long time, 10, 20 years, by the time you go to replace it, it's much more costly than your accumulated depreciation, but at least it gets you a certain amount of money set aside, and we certainly can look at other options besides paying for it all at once with possible financing on that. But at least we would have some money earmarked for that type of thing. And then the board has a formal policy that we discuss in the, I specify exactly in the references as to our early debt extinguishment reserves, and that has to do with our pension bonds. And in that case, we do have $11.9 million. We show a minimum that's actually a little bit higher than that, but we bumped up the amount that we were budgeting towards that, so we should be catching up with that, with the minimum within the next couple of years. And that puts us in a position to not be subject to variable interest rates, and we have 2 different dates, 2018 and 2025, that we are able to retire that debt, auction rates securities. Okay, so we talked about the different kinds of reserves that we're recommending that we work towards establishing. We have a section on page 9 where we talk about when we would use the reserves, and on the operating reserves, those would be used for cash flow. We're able to have a fairly low amount, even though we are primarily funded by property taxes and don't receive that money usually until January, because we have a credit line that we describe in here, our dry period funding with the County of Sacramento, and that's up to $85 million. Without that, we would definitely have to have a much larger minimum. As far as the self-insurance, those reserves are spent as we have claims. We have a third-party administrator, York, that handles that for us. And then the compensated absences would be spent as we have obligations to pay those off. And then as far as all the stuff, all of the types of reserves that have to do with capital, those would all be done via our normal budgeting process. And then in the case where we have something that was unexpected or unplanned, then we would follow our basic purchasing policies and bring them to the board for approval as needed. Our early extinguishment of debt service reserves would only be used to pay principal and interest. And then our fiduciary reserves would be, the spending of those would be determined by that deferred compensation committee. And then the SERPed reserves would only be used to pay retiree medical premiums, and we have no discretion over that. That's the beauty of having a trust. It's, once it's put in there, it's restricted in use. And presently, what we're doing as far as our payment of insurance premiums for retirees is we pay the premiums out of our own general fund, and then with our new policy to fund the annual required contribution, the difference between what we are paying out to for the retirees' premiums and that annual required contribution is what we're depositing in the trust, and we'll be doing that on a monthly basis. And then as far as procedures, are a number of events where I would do an analysis similar to this appendix. I will mention that we'll be labeling this Appendix 1, and then there was one date on page 11 that said June 20th was the date of this appendix, and it actually should say June 30th, so we'll be correcting that. And so this analysis will be done anytime the board has budget deliberations, anytime we make any changes to our self-insurance, excess insurance policies. We will update this whenever we have a actuarial valuation for either post-retirement medical or workers' compensation. And then in general, if there's a condition that threatens the targeted reserve levels established in this policy. And when we produce this policy for the board, we would then be giving an explanation as to why the reserve levels are not at the targeted level and a course of action to bring them to the reserve levels within the minimum and the maximum.
Now, on that, no, I have a question. While they're not at the targeted levels, is this last page here, you have a spreadsheet. Mm-hmm. Is that what we're going to get at the finance every meeting to see where we're progressing? Or will this, each time you meet with the finance committee, will that fund and then the reserve for that fund be shown to show the progress or to show where we've taken money out of it and where we sit with it?
You know, I can do whatever I'm asked to do by the finance committee, but it was my intention, based on the procedures we put in here, to only do it when we're monitoring budget. Well, we know we do preliminary budget, and we do final budget, and we do a mid-year budget, so they're going to see it at least 3 times during the year. We also do our actuarial valuations for both the workers' comp and the post-retirement medical at least every 2 years. So upon the, when we do those, that would influence this. And also when we have our And at that time, we would update things like our accumulated depreciation can change as we acquire more capital assets. And so at periodic times, I would say that I would expect that this analysis would probably be done at least 4 times a year.
And let me chime in here. From the Finance Committee, we appreciated this because this is the first time that we're going through this. So this is a place to start. It's a living document, and we can go through it and make changes and adjust it as necessary. But we've got a place to start that sets numbers, and we're going to work on procedures on how to put money into these and when. Did a lot of research on reserve policies and everything, and we can be as detailed as we want in it, but at this point, we felt it was a very good place to start. And with Rhonda's assistance, since she had a lot to do with some of the definitions and everything for other agencies in her former life, we feel we've got a very good person that we can work with in designing this and moving forward with it.
And what we were trying to do is just give a framework to start with, and with the intention, and this is one of the things maybe Chief Hinkie had mentioned to the Finance Committee, is that, if accumulating these reserves at the target levels have an impact on our service to the community, we want to do it carefully and thoughtfully. It's where we want to be, but we also want to make sure that we're meeting our other responsibilities.
Mr. Chairman, if I may, direct your attention to page 9 of 11 at the top, number 2. Is there something we can do on these mics to kill the feedback? Yeah, maybe we want to do that.
Ring or echo.
What I would like to say is that when reclassifying reserves, consideration will be made to all Metro Fire contractual obligations, including the agreements of Local 522. We went through the last 4 years. We would not be where we are at today without the absolute support and working environment of Local 522 and keeping this district solvent. This reserve policy is not intended to completely supersede all other activities, from service to the community, from obligations that we have for 522 and commitments that we've made. And it's meant to be a target to start to move towards. So what I want to make clear is in this draft form that I see language about threatening to the reserves, and I have perused this, but I did not get the amount of time I necessarily wanted to go into in depth in it, although I trust staff implicitly, and this isn't a draft policy. But I want to make sure that it's clear that these are targets that we're trying to get to. And it's not going to happen overnight, and it's not going to happen in 2 years or 3 years. It's going to be an incremental process. And as revenues come back to the district, there are a variety of obligations, including these variety of reserve funds that we have, obligations that we have with 522, who have sacrificed tremendously, and as well as deferred maintenance, deferred fleet, all those types of things. And so as we put this policy before the policy committee, what I want kept in mind is that these are target levels that we're shooting for, and they are not intended to be a superficial barrier or an artificial barrier to be able to continue to do business. And it has been my experience that there are municipalities that use these as, so it shall be written, so it shall be done, and there's no flexibility, and that is not the intent of this reserve policy, and I just wanted to make that clear. I think that the Finance Department, CFO McFarland, they've done a tremendous job on putting this together. I think that there is language that is protection, provides protection to all parties involved, so that this document isn't misused down the road. That concludes my remarks. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
No, that was basically where I was going with this. That was my concern. I mean, it's a target, but once you put that out there, we hear it all the time about these unfunded liabilities and how our pensions are unfunded, and we've obviously taken steps to help that. But I would hate for somebody to see this report and see that our goal should be 12 million in the operating reserves and we only have 8. So therefore, we're not managing the district in a wise manner, and we need to dump 4 million in there right away to catch it up. So that was my concern, is make sure that when we present this, that we do it in the fashion that the chief was talking about, that these are goals, we need to do that, but we also have other operating obligations.
Yeah, Chairman Pearson, when we put the budget together next year, as tax revenues so slowly and painfully start to come back in, there's a lot of rebuilding that's going to need to be done, and we would be just happy with a very, very little incremental increase every year in the reserves. But that's with building other things at the same time. So, I think the CFO hit it on the head. We're not going to sacrifice service or obligations because we have some artificial deadline in our mind that we have to have X amount of dollars sitting in the bank. And the fact that we have an 8% reserve when a lot of agencies operated a 5% reserve at the minimum. I represented that. I think Moody's and Fitch used to say 5% was a minimum reserve. We're trying to be more proactive than that. We're actually at 8 as we sit today. And but there's that clear understanding that there's a rebuilding process, and it's about rebuilding a variety of pots at the same time as we go, and very incrementally.
And the other thing to remember too is we're making our best efforts to comply with the recommendations from the auditor. And when your auditor says, you should be doing this, this is what we do. And this is what we're doing. So we're making the best efforts to set the goals and guidelines for the future. It's a place to start. And with Rhonda and her crew's assistance, I believe that we're in the right path, right process right now to move forward and start a good plan. And it gives a planning document for the future too.
No, I completely
Yeah,
agree.
and-
I'd love to have this much money on hand right now. And hopefully in the future we will, and we'll be sitting quite pretty, and we'll be able to not have to worry about cuts that we've had to do the last few years. So I definitely support it.
Right, and, to the credit of Metro Fire and this board, we have a balanced budget, even though we're sitting now at a time where we have $19 million less in property tax revenue than we had in 2009. So we are not flush by any means. We are keeping our head above water, and we are making a plan for the future. And in order to give us the most flexibility possible, no target dates have been put in this plan. And so it really is just bringing these various obligations to light and what would be a good amount to have when we have the resources to do it.
Good. I like that explanation. That makes sense.
I was going to say, in terms of planning going forward, if it's at the pleasure of the committee to move this to the full board for a formal adoption,
Yeah.
would that be the consensus at this point?
Yeah, you got to make that motion.
I'll make a motion to approve the reserve policy as written and as the corrections were made into it from the Finance Committee, and that we move it to the full board.
I second that. Call.
Director Monk.
Aye.
Pearson.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Good deal. So we'll move it on. Thank you very much for your
Thank
time.
you.
Appreciate all that.
Thanks for your hard work too, Rhonda, and your entire staff. I know this was not an easy thing to put together.
All right, that concludes our committee. We don't have another one scheduled. So with that, unless you have any comments, we'll go ahead and adjourn till our next committee. Thank you very much.
Quick, painless.